Everyone is watching Hormuz the same way. They see the missiles, the warships, the familiar choreography of American power in a crisis zone. They assume this is another test of who has the bigger fleet, the better hardware, the stronger hand. But that may be the wrong way to look at it, because Iran does not need to defeat the US Navy in open battle to change the balance here. It only needs to make control of Hormuz so dangerous, so expensive, and so politically charged that every American move starts carrying a new kind of cost. For decades, Washington's real strength in the Gulf was not just firepower. It was the belief that global shipping would keep moving because America could keep it moving. Now that belief is under pressure. Ships may still pass, oil may still flow, but if every transit becomes a gamble, every insurance decision becomes strategic, and every response risks a wider crisis, then the real story is no longer about military supremacy. It is about whether the old price of order in whole. What if the most important battle in the Strait of Hormuz is not happening on the surface at all? Most people, when they think about a crisis in Hormuz, imagine the obvious things first. They picture carriers, destroyers, missiles lifting off in the dark, fighter jets streaking across the Gulf, and the familiar spectacle of military power trying to impose order through visibility and force. That is how modern conflict is usually presented to the public. Big platforms, big explosions, big declarations. But that framing misses the real story. Because in Hormuz, the decisive question is not simply who has more firepower. The decisive question is who can make control itself unbearably expensive. Who can turn a narrow waterway into a place where every transit becomes a gamble, every insurance calculation becomes political, and every display of strength carries the risk of strategic embarrassment. That is where Iran's real leverage begins. Iran does not need to defeat the United States Navy in a conventional sense. It does not need to sink an aircraft carrier or win some cinematic naval showdown. It only needs to create enough uncertainty, enough friction, enough persistent risk that the old model of American maritime supremacy starts to look less like a guarantee and more like an increasingly costly performance. And that is why Hormuz matters far beyond the Gulf. Because if the world's most important energy choke point can no longer be kept predictably safe by the power that claims to protect global shipping, then the issue is no longer just military. It becomes geopolitical. It becomes economic. It becomes psychological. What is being tested in Hormuz is not merely the security of ships. It is the price of order itself. To understand why this matters, you have to begin with the map. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another stretch of contested water. It is one of those rare places in geopolitics where geography does not merely shape events. It disciplines them. It compresses choices. It punishes miscalculation. And above all, it gives smaller powers opportunities they would never have in open space. On paper, Hormuz looks wide enough, but strategic geography is never about paper width. It is about usable width, navigable channels, water depth, traffic density, and how all of those factors interact under stress. In reality, what matters is that an enormous share of the world's energy trade passes through a very narrow, very fragile corridor. That means even a limited disruption here does not stay local for long. It moves outward through tanker rates, insurance premiums, energy futures, shipping schedules, and then quietly into inflation, utility bills, freight costs, and political pressure in capitals far from the Gulf. That is why Hormuz is better understood not as a border zone, but as a valve in the global system. And valves are powerful because they do not need to be fully closed to change behavior. They only need to become unreliable. This is the point many observers miss. The real power of a choke point is not always in total blockade. Often, it lies in selective uncertainty. If ships can pass but not confidently, if oil can move but at a rising premium, if governments can reassure markets but not fully convince them, then the choke point is already exerting pressure. In that sense, Hormuz is not important merely because of what moves through it. It is important because instability there can force the entire world to recalculate the cost of normal, This is where Iran's strategy becomes much easier to understand once you stop judging it by the standards of a conventional navy. Iran is not trying to match the United States ship for ship, sonar for sonar, or aircraft for aircraft. It cannot win that contest, and it knows it. So it is playing a different game. It is investing not in symmetric dominance, but in asymmetric denial. Not in the ability to control the sea in the American sense, but in the ability to make control of that sea costly, fragile, and politically exhausting for everyone else. That is a very different kind of power. Small submarines, naval mines, fast attack craft, shore-based missiles, drones, coastal surveillance networks, none of these systems taken alone can replace a blue water navy. That is not their purpose. Their purpose is to create friction, to cloud the picture, to force larger and more sophisticated militaries into a constant cycle of caution, escort, search, clearance, and second-guessing. In other words, Iran is not trying to destroy the architecture of American power outright. It is trying to stress it. And this matters because stressing a system is often cheaper than defeating it. A mine that costs a tiny fraction of a warship can still alter the behavior of an entire fleet. A submarine that never fires a torpedo can still change insurance rates, delay convoys, and unsettle commanders. The psychological effect can be strategic, even when the physical damage remains limited. That is the logic at work in Hormuz. Iran does not need a dramatic victory. It only needs to convince the United States, its partners, and the market that every attempt to preserve normal shipping will now come with a price high enough to force hesitation. But this is the point where the analysis has to become more disciplined, because disruption is not the same thing as control. It is one thing to make a choke point dangerous. It is another thing entirely to govern the consequences of that danger. Iran can raise the cost of transit. It can inject uncertainty into military planning. It can make insurers nervous, shipping companies cautious, and energy markets jumpy. All of that is real. All of that matters. But none of that automatically means Iran can convert instability into a durable regional order on its own terms. This distinction is crucial. A state can be strong enough to spoil without being strong enough to stabilize. It can be powerful enough to frighten the system, but not powerful enough to manage what happens after the system starts adapting. And systems do adapt. Gulf states look for alternative routes. Buyers diversify supply. Markets price in risk. Outside powers adjust deployments. What begins as leverage can, over time, generate countermeasures that narrow the value of the original threat. That is why Hormuz is not simply a story about who can intimidate whom. It is also a story about limits. Iran's geography gives it leverage, yes. Its asymmetric toolkit gives it leverage, yes. But Iran also depends on the same regional system it is pressuring. It does not operate outside the energy map. It lives inside it. If Hormuz becomes too unstable for too long, Tehran does not stand above that damage. It absorbs part of it. So the more precise way to understand Iran's strategy is this. It is not trying to own Hormuz in the old imperial sense. It is trying to ensure that no one else can treat Hormuz as secure without taking Iran into account. That is a powerful form of influence. But influence is still not the same thing as mastery. This is why the real American problem in Hormuz is larger than submarines, mines, or even shipping lanes. The deeper problem is credibility. For decades, the United States has not simply projected power in the Gulf. It has projected a promise that the world's most important sea lanes would remain open, navigable, and ultimately protected under an American-backed security order. That promise has been one of the invisible foundations of global trade. Most of the time, people do not think about it precisely because it has seemed so normal. But geopolitical order only looks natural when it is working. The moment a narrow waterway like Hormuz becomes persistently risky, the question is no longer just whether the U.S. Navy can destroy targets or escort tankers. The question becomes whether America can still guarantee a level of predictability that markets, allies, and regional partners are willing to trust. That is a much harder test, because credibility is not measured by press conferences, it is measured by behavior. Do ships keep moving? Do insurers stay calm? Do allies still believe Washington can manage escalation without losing control of the costs? And here is the trap. If Washington responds too cautiously, it risks signaling weakness. But if it responds too forcefully, it may prove Iran's point by turning a manageable risk into a larger economic and political crisis. In other words, the United States is not dealing with a simple military challenge. It is dealing with a coercive strategy designed to make every available option expensive. That is what sophisticated asymmetric pressure does. It does not defeat a superpower outright. It forces the superpower into a series of bad trade-offs. And in Hormuz, bad trade-offs can become strategic very quickly. But the Strait of Hormuz is not just an American problem, and not just an Iranian arena. The countries that live with its consequences every day see this crisis through a very different lens. For Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the issue is not abstract naval theory. It is revenue, export reliability, investor confidence, and regime stability. They want protection from Iranian coercion. Yes, but they also fear a wider war that could turn the Gulf itself into an economic self-inflicted wound. That creates a familiar regional paradox. The same states that depend on American security guarantees may also be the least enthusiastic about a confrontation that spirals beyond anyone's control. Oman occupies an especially important place in this picture. Geography gives it relevance, but diplomacy gives it weight. Oman has long understood that survival in this neighborhood depends less on dramatic alignment than on preserving room to talk to everyone. In a Hormuz crisis, that makes Muscat more than a bystander. It becomes one of the few political spaces where de-escalation can still be imagined. Then there is Qatar, whose position reminds us that Hormuz is not only about oil, it is about liquefied natural gas, long-term supply contracts, Asian demand, and the broader credibility of Gulf energy exports. When instability rises in Hormuz, the shock travels not just through crude markets, but through electricity systems, industrial planning, and winter heating expectations far beyond the Middle East. This is why a Prof. Jiang reading of Hormuz has to move beyond the binary of Washington versus Tehran. Hormuz is a regional pressure chamber. The real question is not simply who can threaten it, but which states must keep living inside the system after the headlines fade. This is where the story becomes even more modern and in some ways more unsettling, because the most decisive battlefield may not wear a uniform at all. In a crisis like Hormuz, markets do not wait for perfect information. Insurance firms do not wait for final attribution. Shipping companies do not wait for historians. They react to risk as it is perceived in real time. And once that happens, uncertainty itself becomes a weapon. That is the quiet genius of pressure in a choke point. A mine does not have to explode to change behavior. A submarine does not have to fire to slow traffic. A threat does not have to close the strait officially to make the route commercially painful. All it takes is enough doubt, enough ambiguity about what is in the water, what could happen next, and who would bear the loss if something goes wrong. At that point, the logic of the market begins doing strategic work on behalf of the threat itself. This is why I would argue that Hormuz is not only a military contest, it is a contest over expectations. Can insurers still price passage as manageable? Can shipping executives justify transit to their boards? Can energy buyers trust delivery schedules? Can governments calm markets without overcommitting militarily? Those questions matter because global systems are not sustained by force alone. They are sustained by confidence in routines, confidence in schedules, confidence in the idea that normal commerce can continue tomorrow much as it did today. Once that confidence starts to crack, the effects spread far beyond the Gulf. So when people ask whether Hormuz is really closed, they are often asking the wrong question. The more revealing question is whether the market still behaves as though Hormuz is normal. Because once normal becomes expensive enough, disruption has already begun. Europe's caution in a Hormuz crisis is often dismissed as weakness, but that is too shallow a reading. What we are really seeing is something more important, a divergence in strategic priorities inside the Western camp itself. From Washington's perspective, Hormuz is tied to credibility, deterrence, and the larger principle of freedom of navigation. For many European governments, the picture looks different. They also care about energy flows and maritime stability, of course, but they tend to weigh escalation risk much more heavily. They ask a different question. Not simply, can force restore order, but also, at what political, economic, and military cost, and for whose benefit? That difference matters, because alliances are strongest when danger is clear, interests are aligned, and the burden feels shared. But in gray zone crises, especially in a place as combustible as the Gulf, those conditions weaken. Europe sees the possibility of being pulled into a confrontation it did not design, cannot fully control, and may not define in the same terms as the United States. That does not mean Europe is abandoning the West. It means European states are calculating more narrowly, more soberly, and more transactionally, and that in itself is a sign of the times. In a more strictly unipolar era, American preferences often set the rhythm for Allied alignment. Today, that rhythm is less automatic. When costs rise and outcomes become murky, allies do not simply salute and follow. They hedge, they delay. They ask harder questions about exposure, capacity, and exit. So Europe's hesitation over Hormuz is not just a footnote to the crisis. It is part of the crisis. It reveals a broader truth about the international system. When order becomes expensive, even partners begin to debate how much of that order they are actually willing to buy. Hormuz is also forcing a harder question that policymakers often prefer not to ask. What are the real limits of economic coercion? For years, the dominant assumption in Washington has been that sustained financial pressure, sanctions, and isolation would steadily narrow Iran's strategic options. And in many ways they have. Sanctions can weaken an economy, reduce access to technology, constrain procurement, and make long-term military modernization far more difficult. But pressure does not always produce passivity. Sometimes it produces adaptation. That is the part too many analyses miss. A state under constraint does not always try to compete everywhere. Often it looks for the one or two arenas where relatively modest investments can still generate outsized leverage. In Iran's case, Hormuz is exactly that kind of arena. Tehran may not be able to build a navy that rivals the United States on the open ocean, but it does not need to. It only needs enough asymmetric capability, enough local knowledge, and enough tolerance for risk to make a narrow strategic corridor harder to manage than its adversaries would like. That reveals something uncomfortable about sanctions as a tool of statecraft. They can absolutely impose pain. They can degrade broad national power, but they do not necessarily eliminate a rival's ability to impose pain in return. In fact, under certain conditions, they may push that rival toward cheaper, narrower, and more asymmetric forms of influence. So the lesson of Hormuz is not that economic pressure fails. That would be too simple. The lesson is that coercion has limits, especially when geography helps the weaker side. You can make a country poorer, you can make it more constrained, but if it still retains a choke point, a grievance, and a handful of effective tools, it may remain dangerous in exactly the ways that matter most. So where does this go from here? If you look past the rhetoric, I think there are really only two plausible paths ahead, and neither one looks like a clean victory for anyone. The first path is a quiet accommodation, not a grand diplomatic breakthrough, not a historic reconciliation, just an unspoken understanding that everyone has reached the edge of what they can afford. Iran maintains enough pressure to preserve deterrence and prove that Hormuz cannot be treated as an uncontested American-managed space. The United States, meanwhile, avoids steps that would turn a dangerous standoff into a larger regional fire. Shipping resumes unevenly, insurance stays high, energy markets remain nervous, but not panicked. In other words, the system bends without fully breaking. That is the more rational path, but rational paths are not always the ones history chooses. The second path is escalation through accumulation. Not necessarily because one side wants a major war, but because narrow waterways leave very little room for error. One misread signal, one mine strike, one encounter at sea, one act of retaliation meant to restore deterrence, which instead convinces the other side that a broader attack is coming. This is how regional crises become systemic shocks, not always through deliberate design, but through compressed geography, mutual suspicion, and political leaders operating under pressure. And that is what makes Hormuz so dangerous. The real threat is not only the weapons in the water, it is the number of actors trying to send signals at the same time in an environment where every signal can be misread. When the space is narrow, the margin for miscalculation narrows with it. That is why the future of Hormuz may be decided less by intention than by timing, fear, and the cost of a single mistake. So in the end, the real struggle in Hormuz is not about who owns more ships, who can launch more missiles, or who can dominate a headline cycle for 48 hours. It is about something deeper and far more consequential. Who gets to define the conditions under which order still functions? That is the central geopolitical question. Iran may not be strong enough to control Hormuz in the classic imperial sense. It cannot build a stable regional order on demand. It cannot replace the global role the United States has played in securing maritime trade. But that does not mean it is powerless. Far from it. What Iran can do is force everyone else to acknowledge that order in Hormuz is no longer something that can be priced, protected, or assumed without reference to Iran's capacity to disrupt it. And that alone is a form of strategic leverage. The United States, for its part, remains vastly more powerful in the broadest sense. It still has reach, alliances, financial tools, and military depth that Iran cannot match. But Hormuz reminds us of a hard truth about power. Superiority is not the same thing as effortless control. A superpower can still find itself trapped by geography, by cost, by escalation risk, and by the growing reluctance of others to absorb those burdens automatically. That is why Hormuz matters so much, because what is being tested there is not simply the safety of a shipping lane. It is whether the old model of order, American protection, market confidence, allied support, and predictable transit can still hold under sustained asymmetric pressure. And if it cannot, then the future will belong not to the actor with the biggest fleet, but to the actor most capable of turning uncertainty into influence, cost into leverage, and geography into power.